Many folks in the Shenandoah Valley are unaware that during the last year of the Great Revival between 1799 and 1805, that a family in Augusta County was subject to the title of the Jerkers. Jerkers is a term people of that time used to describe Presbyterian parishioners that experienced involuntary convulsions where their heads lashed violently backward and forward, a behavior they attributed to the Holy Spirit. Yesterday, historian and associate professor of religious studies of the University of Richmond, Douglas Winiarski, informed 70 people about that family, the Tate family of Greenville, Virginia, and the religious phenomenon as a whole at the Augusta County Historical Society's spring meeting in the public meeting room at the Augusta County Government Center in Verona, Virginia. Here's Douglas Winiarski.
Robert Tate and his children achieved widespread notoriety as jerkers. Family members experienced repeated bouts of the jerks, violent, involuntary convulsions in which the subject's heads lashed backward and forward in quick succession, as one observer explained, nearly touching the floor behind and before. Dramatic reports of the jerkers of Greenville drew the attention of 3 travelers who visited Clover Mount during the bitterly cold winter of 1805. The strangers called themselves believers, although the world's people knew them as shaking Quakers, or Shakers. On New Year's Day that year, Issachar Bates, John Meacham, and Benjamin Seth Youngs set off from New Lebanon, New York on a 1,200-mile journey seeking like-minded religious radicals. 1 month later, Robert Tate, his adult children, and their spouses sat down with the Shaker missionaries and patiently answered more than a dozen questions about the theological and experiential dimensions of their bodily fits. Several members of Tate's family were taken with the jerks during the interview. While sitting on a chair, Youngs excitedly explained in a letter to the Shaker ministry in New Lebanon, their bodies would appear instantly stiff, the hands locked, the eyes closed, and the head jerked backwards over the chair, all as quick as lightning. For a brief period, beginning in the summer of 1803, accounts of the religious revivals on the trans-Appalachian frontier were filled with news of the jerks. Sometimes these spasmodic, shuddering gesticulations of neck and head operated like the hiccups. At other times, jerkers collapsed to the ground, bounced from place to place like a football, or thrashed like a fish when thrown out of the water. The jerks purportedly struck riders on horseback, men plowing in the fields, boys at their school desks, young girls drinking tea, families at supper, people in bed, musicians at play, and nursing mothers. They erupted without warning and without regard to age, class, gender, or physical constitution.
Winiarski would go on to talk about the strange religious phenomenon of the time and the Shakers' documentation of it for almost an hour. I caught up with Winiarski after his informative presentation.
Those people had been deeply involved in the Great Revival and had experienced a lot of somatic phenomena like the jerks. But as the Shakers began to convince them that jerking was just the first step, or preparatory work, many of those people began to give up on their jerking practices and begin to embrace the Shakers' unusual dancing, laboring practices. So that's why the jerks kind of subside and among their earliest converts.
What happened to the jerkers of the Great Revival? According to most accounts, they simply faded away. Robert Tate, for example, lived out his life at Clover Mount. He was buried at Bethel Presbyterian Church in Stanton in 1832, where he had served for nearly 3 decades as a distinguished elder. His children married and started their own families here in the Shenandoah Valley. One daughter migrated with her husband to the Old Northwest, where they became founders of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and its new university. But there's little evidence that the Tates or any members of his family continued to experience the jerks after the winter of 1805.
Now, I noticed you said that it kind of died out. Now, I mean, is there evidence to suggest that it still goes on? Because, you hear about people speaking in tongues, falling out in churches, things like that.
I think a lot of people at the time thought that the jerks died out. But what really happens is that they go underground. Presbyterian and Methodists and Baptists begin to distance themselves from these kinds of extreme bodily phenomenon that characterized the Great Revival in the early 1800s. And yet many lay people were still fascinated by those phenomena. And they just simply sort of drifted away from those mainstream churches. So while we can't see the jerking phenomena going on in the middle decades of the 19th century, my hunch is that they were still very prevalent. And particularly they would resurface among holiness and Pentecostal evangelicals at the turn of the 20th century. And that's what you saw in the video with the serpent handling community in Gully Bridge, West Virginia.
What about when you watch TV and you watch these TV preachers and they do the thing with their hands?
Yeah.
Is that a form of jerking?
Maybe not a form of jerking per se, but the category of speaking in tongues, which is one of the defining features of some kinds of Pentecostal communities today, is a related phenomenon. And so if you see those things among Pentecostal evangelicals, what we're seeing is a version of what we would have seen back at the Great Revival in the early 1800s.
Is there any evidence to suggest that any of this was demonic or satanic in any way, shape, or form?
Only a handful of people actually wanted to attribute these things to demonic possession, which was a live concept for people at the turn of the 19th century. More often, people would try to medicalize it by saying it was a nervous disorder or a form of epidemic chorea, what they called St. Vitus dance. So most people agreed that it was an involuntary phenomenon, but whether it was an authentic religious thing or whether it was some kind of a disease or a sort of medical condition was sort of the big debate. Whether it was a demonic thing, I think that was only a minority of people that would make that claim.
In Augusta County, Theodore Whitelow for Breaking Through.